The purpose of this exploration is to delve deep into the enigmatic figure of the Mouth of Sauron, whose rise and fall embody the darker facets of ambition, cruelty, and submission to ultimate evil. His journey from a mortal black Númenórean to the twisted herald of Sauron is shrouded in mystery and layered with elements of manipulation, sorcery, and a thirst for power that eventually consumed him. This tale, while horrifying, holds an irresistible allure for those captivated by the shadows of Middle-earth. Imagine the stark contrast between his beginnings as a human, albeit one of Númenórean descent, and his transformation into an almost otherworldly figure. It raises questions. What drives someone to abandon their humanity for power? What does it mean to become the mouthpiece of a malevolent force, to forsake identity and morality entirely? The Mouth of Sauron represents not just servitude, but an extension of Sauron's will, a reflection of the Dark Lord's malice, cunning, and domination. This video seeks to unravel his story, from the boy raised in the shadow of darkness to the creature whose presence was enough to strike fear into the hearts of the free peoples. We begin in the desolate lands south of Umbar, where the harsh and unforgiving environment shaped not only the land, but the people who lived there. These barren lands, far removed from the thriving civilizations of Gondor or Arnor, were places where survival meant strength, cunning, and an often ruthless disregard for others. The young boy who would become the Mouth of Sauron was born into a family emblematic of these values, where ambition, cruelty, and a disdain for weakness were ingrained from the earliest moments of life. His father was a man of great ambition, but also great cruelty. To him, mercy was the domain of the weak, a flaw that had led to the supposed failures of the Númenóreans who had sided with Elendil. The boy's father drilled this belief into him relentlessly, ensuring that he grew up not only despising the heirs of Númenor's faithful, but also determined to dominate and crush anyone who showed similar weakness. Lessons were taught with a harsh hand, the boy's body and spirit hardened by a father who saw his son as both a legacy and a tool. The boy's mother, however, brought a different kind of darkness into his life. She was a practitioner of forbidden arts, a sorceress who dabbled in the arcane practices that had long since been banished from the Númenórean kingdoms. From her, the boy learned to manipulate the unseen forces of the world. She nurtured his intellect and his curiosity, feeding him tales of the dark power that had been Númenor's undoing and, in her view, its greatest strength. While his father taught him to dominate through force, his mother taught him to manipulate and twist others to his will. Together, these lessons created a young man who was manipulative, cruel, and utterly devoid of compassion. As the boy grew into a young man, his ambitions outgrew the desolate lands of his birth. He turned his gaze toward Umbar, the fabled haven of black Númenórean power and intrigue. Umbar, a city steeped in corruption and ambition, was the perfect crucible for someone of his talents. Here, he could hone the lessons of his childhood on a grander scale, immersing himself in a world where betrayal and ambition were not only tolerated, but celebrated. His rise in Umbar was neither swift nor easy, but it was inevitable. Using a blend of manipulation, sorcery, and ruthlessness, he began carving out a space for himself among the city's ruling elite. At first, he moved in the shadows, learning the webs of power that connected the city's many factions. He aligned himself with a powerful sorcerer who not only expanded his knowledge of dark magic, but also shared with him the secret to prolonging his life. This sorcerer saw potential in the young man, perhaps even as a successor, but underestimated his apprentice's boundless ambition. Eventually, the young man surpassed his master, leaving behind a trail of betrayal and death that cemented his reputation in Umbar. As his power grew, so did his arrogance. He began to see himself as a figure of destiny, a man chosen to reshape the world. The darkness that had always been a part of him now consumed him entirely, leaving him disconnected from the humanity he had once possessed. This transformation was reflected not only in his demeanor, but in his very presence. Those who dealt with him spoke of a man who seemed less human with each passing year, his eyes filled with a cold malice, his voice carrying the weight of a soul blackened by sorcery and ambition. It was during this period of his life that he first became aware of Sauron. Whispers of the Dark Lord's growing power in Mordor reached Umbar, and for the ambitious young man, these were not tales of fear, but of opportunity. Sauron represented the ultimate power, a force that could not only crush the enemies of Númenor's Black Line, but also grant immortality, dominion, and purpose to those who served him. The pull of Sauron's influence was irresistible to someone like him, a man who had already sacrificed so much of his humanity in pursuit of power. It was not long before he resolved to make the perilous journey to Mordor, leaving behind the city where he had risen to power in search of a destiny even darker than the one he had already forged. The call to Mordor was not one that could be ignored. For years, whispers of Sauron's resurgence had reached even the most distant corners of Middle-earth, and for those attuned to the dark arts, his influence was palpable. To the man who would become the mouth of Sauron, these whispers were more than rumor. They were a summons. The promises of power, dominion, and immortality resonated deeply with him. He saw in Sauron a kindred spirit, a being who had transcended mortality and weakness to become something greater. The journey to Mordor was fraught with peril, but he embraced it as a test of his worth. Crossing into Mordor, he felt the oppressive weight of Sauron's presence even before reaching Barad-dûr. It was as if the very land was alive with malice, watching his every step. When he finally stood before the Dark Tower, he knelt willingly, pledging himself to Sauron without hesitation. This moment marked a turning point in his life. No longer was he an ambitious sorcerer seeking power on his own terms. He had become a servant of the Dark Lord, bound to Sauron's will and devoted to spreading his master's influence across Middle-earth. Under Sauron's guidance, his mastery of sorcery deepened. He was taught to channel Sauron's power, becoming a conduit for the Dark Lord's will. The extension of his lifespan was the first and most obvious reward for his loyalty. No longer bound by the limitations of mortal life, he was free to pursue his ambitions without the fear of time cutting them short. Yet this came at a cost. His humanity, already eroded by years of cruelty and ambition, was stripped away entirely. He embraced his role as Sauron's emissary with a zeal that bordered on fanaticism, taking pride in the fear and despair he inspired in others. The transformation into the mouth of Sauron was as much a physical process as it was a spiritual one. Over time, his appearance became grotesque, a reflection of the darkness within him. His once handsome features were twisted into something almost unrecognizable, his skin pale and lifeless, his eyes burning with malice. This change was not simply the result of sorcery, but a manifestation of his complete surrender to Sauron's will. He had become more than a man. He was a vessel for Sauron's power, a living extension of the Dark Lord's malice. As the mouth of Sauron, he became Sauron's chief emissary and herald. His role was to act as the voice of the Dark Lord, speaking on his behalf to allies and enemies alike. This position granted him immense influence, but it also demanded absolute loyalty. He carried out Sauron's will with ruthless efficiency, manipulating and intimidating those who dared to oppose him. His cunning and malice made him a formidable diplomat, capable of bending even the most stubborn foes to Sauron's will. One of his earliest missions was to stir the Haradrim into action against Gondor. These southern peoples, already predisposed to distrust the heirs of Númenor's faithful, were ripe for manipulation. Through a combination of promises and threats, he convinced their leaders to march against Gondor, framing the conflict as a chance to reclaim lost honor and power. The Haradrim, emboldened by his words and aided by Sauron's forces, became a significant thorn in Gondor's side, further destabilizing the region. Perhaps his most infamous mission was the interrogation of Gollum. When Gollum was captured in Mordor, the mouth of Sauron took personal charge of extracting information from the wretched creature. The torture was as much psychological as it was physical, designed to break Gollum's will entirely. Through this, he learned of the One Ring's theft by a Baggins of the Shire. This information, while incomplete, was critical to Sauron's plans, setting into motion the events that would lead to the War of the Ring. Another key mission was his embassy to Erebor, where he attempted to sway the dwarves to Sauron's side. This mission was particularly challenging, as the dwarves were notoriously resistant to external influence. Nevertheless, he approached them with a mixture of promises and veiled threats, offering wealth and power in exchange for their loyalty. When the dwarves refused, he returned to Barad-dûr with grim satisfaction, knowing that their defiance would only make their eventual downfall more satisfying. His final stand at the Black Gate was a culmination of his role as Sauron's emissary. Standing before Aragorn and the captains of the West, he delivered Sauron's terms with a mixture of mockery and menace, seeking to sow despair among the free peoples. To further demoralize them, he displayed Frodo's belongings, hinting at the ring-bearer's capture and demise. His confidence was unshaken, certain that Sauron's victory was inevitable. Yet he underestimated the resolve of Gandalf and Aragorn, who rejected his terms and stood firm against his intimidation. When he retreated, it was not out of fear, but to prepare for the inevitable slaughter of the West's armies. The fall of Mordor was as much a shock to him as it was to Sauron's other servants. When the One Ring was destroyed and Barad-dûr collapsed, the connection between him and Sauron was severed. For the first time in centuries, he found himself alone, stripped of the power and purpose that had defined his existence. His fate after the fall of Mordor remains ambiguous. Some believe he perished alongside Sauron, his life force tied irrevocably to the Dark Lords. Others speculate that he survived, retreating into the shadows to plot his return to power. Regardless of his ultimate fate, the mouth of Sauron left behind a legacy of fear and corruption. He stands as a cautionary tale of what happens when ambition and cruelty are allowed to run unchecked, when a man surrenders his humanity in pursuit of power. His story, while horrifying, serves as a reminder of the enduring allure of darkness and the cost of embracing it fully. For those who study the histories of Middle-earth, he remains an enigma, a figure shrouded in mystery, his ultimate fate unknown, yet his presence felt long after his disappearance. As we close this exploration, the mouth of Sauron lingers in the imagination, a symbol of the depths to which mortals can fall when consumed by ambition and corruption. What became of him after the fall of Sauron? Did he find some measure of redemption, or does he still lurk in the shadows, waiting for an opportunity to reclaim his lost power? These questions, tantalizing and unanswered, ensure that his story remains a compelling and haunting chapter in the history of Middle-earth.